everybody. Man, I'm still not used to Zoom telling me that I'm recording. I don't like that because I don't know if I'm supposed to talk when it's over or while it's doing that. Anyway, hello, everybody. We are, this is a conversation for randos. We are going to attempt to do something like a commentary on the Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke conversation. And we might even let each other speak for 5 or 10 seconds in a row.
Oh, Sam.
What? Well, I was just wondering if you agreed with my take on the Trinity. Can I kind of try and lay that out?
Wait a minute. What's
Christianity, Don? That's Christianity.
I just heard Sam affirm the Trinity. We're done here.
So this was I thought that we would just go around to start the conversation, give our kind of high level impression. And I think, of course, the hard and weird thing to talk about is like how worried, not worried, how much attention or not attention to put on kind of Jordan Peterson's mental state. I don't know who wants to go first. Julian, do you want to go first, or Luke? You look like you're bursting at the seams. Scenes.
Always.
All right.
Always
Luke.
bursting.
Luke, what's your take? What's your high level takeaway from the conversation?
So, I loved the substance of the conversation. I would say, as far as the quality of the ideas and what they're talking about, and even in my opinion, how I think it was a good model, although a certain energy of dialogos. I thought it was fantastic because it was, and I've said this to you guys a lot, part of it's my temperament, but also part of it, I think, is a pushback against McGilchrist's lopsided left-brainedness, is conversations that are less structured and more just following the spirit and the flow are my preference, because I like to talk even above my own head, because I feel like it's more authentic. It feeds into my love of psychoanalysis and getting beyond my kind of platitude level egoic knowing. And things come out, you speak the truth, like out of the heart, the abundance of the mouth speaks.
Luke, all right, let me just ask you this really quick, as just in terms of analyzing what was actually going on in this conversation. When you're having that kind of conversation, are you more or less likely to interrupt?
I think it really depends, because I am aware somewhat of sorry about the cars in the background. I am somewhat aware of my propensity to do that. And I think it depends. You have to just be, you have to be really zoned in relationally in that kind of, in a conversation. And this ties in almost like in an at-one-ment way, where if you're really listening to someone, you're not thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about what you're going to say next. You're not thinking about, your ego is stripped of it, and you're at one. I've talked about it in the Boxer a lot, that it's like a dance, or even making love. When you're making love, it's not selfish. You're not thinking about yourself, but it is selfless. You're not thinking about you, but you are involved. And so, you may interrupt and you may not. I think it just completely depends. And so one thing though, the last thing that I'll say, and I'll let somebody else go, is, I wasn't worried about Peterson at all. Like, I just didn't, all the concerns that people had, I just didn't see. Part of that is maybe that I just don't have as much experience with the kind of concerns that people have personally. And Nate, you and I've talked about this, that we just relate to that kind of energy. I am just in,
I have no idea why.
I am just kind of like in a playful, fawn-like, mischievous, high energy. Big 5 temperament, 98th percentile enthusiasm, 98th percentile extroversion. Like, I'm just like, let's rock and roll. And so I like that kind of energy. And also I tend to be pretty optimistic about things. Like, I think you could have legitimate concerns about Peterson, considering what he went through, but I'm just like, he's going to be fine. Like, there's nothing wrong. But that's just kind of my rosy optimism in that regard, I think.
Well, let's say when you were just talking, and when I was trying my best to just listen and not interrupt you at all, what if I had interrupted you in the middle of that and then said, "Hey, I'm glad you brought up dance. Let's talk about dance and participation." Would that have seemed weird to you? Would that have thrown you off? Would you think that would be a non-productive contribution to the dialogue, or would you see that as related to what you were talking about? Because you were talking about like how dialogos is a participatory activity.
So I think it depends, because so just to make this really personal and transparent, there are times in conversations, both in talking to you, Nate, and in listening to you, where you have that kind of energy, and sometimes it annoys me and sometimes it doesn't.
Good. That's good. I'm glad you're honest about it.
You know, because there are times when you've done it where I'm just like, he's not being self-controlled enough, and he's part of it, and we talked about this too. Part of it is about, are you interrupting to be in a masculine assertive mode where you're just like, these are my ideas and I want to push my agenda? Or are you interrupting out of like a feminine, eager, receptive, tell me more thing? Almost all of his interruptions were like, tell me more, tell me more. Like, what are you saying? Like,
or I think this connects to this. Can you tell me whether you think this connects to this?
Yeah. Okay,
Julian, you had sort of the other end of the spectrum take. What was your impression of Jordan in this conversation?
You're muted. There we go.
Muted, Julian.
Oh.
Yeah, I think I had pretty much the opposite impression than Luke did. Luke would probably want to say this is a difference of perception or temperament or something like that, and maybe he's onto something there. I honestly think the conversation we had about what's going on, there was a whole lot of projection going on. I mean, Luke could see someone engaged in like a high level dialogos and participation and all of the stuff he likes to talk about. I could see someone meant, some kind of, I just thought there was something off about him. And maybe I was just projecting my own psychology or something. And then Nate saw someone on this spiritual journey towards Christianity. And I don't know. So I saw a lot of projection. So I don't pretend to be super objective here, but
my projection was that he was being a bad podcast host.
He was a bad host. Yeah, he was. I think we can agree about that. Like because my take on the conversation is like maybe they should have had this conversation like with the camera off. But because I don't know how many people were able to follow the conversation because it was because they were both relying on their intuition so much, and they understood each other. And like, I think your ability to follow this conversation is going to be very much tied to like how much of the same things that they respectively know do you know, so that you're able to pick up on the shorthand that's going on.
It could be, that could
also,
be. Also,
one other thing I want to throw in is that I think one of the big contrasts of the conversation was the difference between dialogos and philonikeia. So like the desire to join into a participatory union and at one-ment in dialogue. I mean, this is a lot of Vervaeke's whole project to participate in the logos and bring about agape, right? Like that whole thing. And that's set in contrast to this desire for power and domination and winning, Nike, philonikeia. And I think this would get into my bigger critique of the left brain, West control, honest postmodern critique of like phallogocentrism is most of our language in the West has been used, even if it's in a really subtle, nuanced, unseemingly philonikeia way. I think the spirit of it at large is philonikeia. And so I think podcasts are that.
After popping into the Q&A on Vervaeke's server and his community, it's what's going on in his community. So It's like, it's not like he might be talking about that, but like his own community he's created does not reflect what he's talking about.
Right. And so it's like, to me,
it's totally dominated by this sort of like spirit of like propositional philonikeia.
I want to hear more about so
that's true. It was awful. I wanted to stab myself listening to that Q&A. It was awful.
So we were
look at this philonikeia between the Paul Vanderklay and the Paul
I'm going to assert myself to make sure Julian gets to say his 2 cents. So we all were tempted to project onto Peterson various things, but what did you see, Julian? What was it that you were worried about or triggered by, or what it caused you to see in Peterson?
I mean, so Luke just talked about the kind of participatory communion that happened, and I just didn't see the two people connecting. Maybe it happened a bit more towards the end for some strange reason, but I just saw at the beginning, I just couldn't help but see Peterson sort of, it sounded like he was in this very strange mental state where he had like so much internal noise and chaos going on that he just couldn't concentrate on what Vervaeke was saying. And then whenever Vervaeke said something, he would hear a word or a phrase, and then he would kind of jump off on one of the chaotic rabbit trails in his head. And so you could see it. I think that's sort of what was going on with the interruptions. I think one thing that pushes against that way of thinking is that the strange part about all of those rapid fire kind of interruptions were that they kind of started to taper off halfway through the conversation or so. And then you could kind of follow some kind of a narrative thread through the conversation where they started to pick up themes and bring them into a bit more bigger focus. And then there were just these strange comments that he dropped, these very sort of depressive, self-depreciating comments. Something like the obvious one would be the one where he said, he talked about justifying his existence. There was another one where he talked about his
Julian, sorry to pull Peterson on you and interrupt, but I gotta say on that thing, that's like a constant Peterson theme. Like he says that was something all different. The time.
I thought there was something and completely different going on.
He says it in
or like, I'm such a nasty bastard.
Breakdown.
Yeah.
He said, that was also from the conversation. He said, I'm such a nasty bastard. And then he says, his critics think I'm only about Philo and IKEA. So that shows to me a sort of obsession with what are my critics thinking of, and a kind of loss of the sort of being grounded in who he is as a person. And then, so I want to respond to that, Nick, because there was something very different about these self-depreciating comments. It sounded to me like the way they came up conversation was like a kind of undealt with kind of thing he's struggling with at the moment, whereas the darkness he's always brought up is something that he's integrated and dealt with. And, you know, I'm a terrible person, but I know how to deal with it. I know how to embark on the hero's journey to make myself a better thing. But this sounded like it was bubbling up from a
so that is very interesting to me, because like one of my fundamental underlying critiques of Peterson has always been that he's never dealt with that, and where he goes wrong in his thinking is directly tied to the fact that he's never really dealt with that. Like I think like this sort of like, I promise not to use the word Calvinism in this conversation. So I would let me try to phrase it a different way. This sort of like general like POS
theology.
POS theology that is sort of like in the culture, right? In the North American culture at large, like that it's like it's so found like it's that is like he's internalized that a lot. And I've seen him many times and many other like even in the middle of lectures when he's talking about that, like you can see like him on the verge of tears when he's talking, which is why he is so obsessed with the heroic. It's like, so what he resists the theological solution that comes from that theology, even though he's internalized the self-loathing, but he doesn't like the theological solution of unmerited grace. So he's like, no, I want to figure out a way to be like heroic enough that I can prove that I'm worth something.
And what one thing that came up for Peterson in the past 2 years with his illness and all that is just a breakdown of the heroic myth. And now he's starting to talk about community and God and grace, and this is language.
And I would agree with you that maybe he's now running fully up into that. Like he can't even hide it at all. But what I just want to point out is that to me, I've always noticed that, and that's always been there, and it drives a lot of his thought.
I think we can agree and just say that
It's the Pelagian soteriology and the Augustinian anthropology, right? Isn't
Yeah,
that
that's
Van der
exactly it.
Clay's?
Yeah, and they're at tension within
But
him.
all of that is dependent on a post-Cartesian, dualistic, divided view of the world. So,
yes,
so if you don't have that stupid
right,
view,
but no,
none of that matters.
but Luke, this is why he's so excited in this conversation, and this is why this is why he has this kid in the candy store energy, and he's like wanting John to lay all this stuff on him, because John is a non-dualist who has like this very different kind of way of looking at it, and he's hungry for that, because it will help him integrate these things that he's never been able to integrate.
I want to bring up what Jess said. I just want to bring up this one image that Jesse brought up. Jesse Pye. He said he got the idea, or he was seeing it as Peterson continually running into a wall, trying to find the narrow gate. And I think that's what Peterson is doing. He's just banging his head against a wall, and he's looking for that narrow gate, and he just can't see it. And he's, John, help me. You're a Christian. You're a great Christian. I'm a great Christian. Maybe like Jonathan Peugeot, right? Where is it? Let's go.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't quite know about that. I mean, that sounds like.
Julian, did you see any of the positive elements that other people were reflecting on?
I think I was too distracted by the craziness. I mean, it's a very hard conversation to listen to. It's not pleasant. I've been wanting to do a second run, but I just
did you get through the whole thing on the first time?
I did. Okay. I did. I did think it got better near the end.
Okay. So Julian, I really want it. There's a section of it, there was no transcript for this. So I actually had to listen to this multiple times to get this down, because, you're saying that there was nothing interesting in this conversation. This is something that Peterson actually said.
No, he was saying it was difficult to listen to, not that there was nothing.
Oh, okay. Difficult to listen to. Oh, gotcha. Okay.
I just wanted to make one more point before I jump off. Sorry, I wish I could stay and talk, but I had some thoughts about the final part about Heidegger, and I think it connects to a lot of stuff we've already talked about. But what struck me about that part was how Peterson was genuinely surprised that Heidegger was making this critique about how modernity is characterized by grasping and controlling and power and dominance over nature and humans and so on. And it sounded like he actually never thought about modernity in those terms. And my way of thinking about that is that I think Peterson's critique of modernity actually comes from the opposite direction. He's always seen modernity. The problem with modernity for him has always been a kind of Nietzschean thing where it's sort of too feminized. It's kind of the Fight Club version of modernity, where you could just have the guy lying on the couch eating his Cheetos and on the airplane, and he has all of these small serving things, and this is just not the sort of conditions conducive for the kinds of evolved, sort of violent, hierarchical creatures we are. And so this kind of equalizing plastic nature of modern society makes it difficult for the kind of adventurous beings we are to survive. So I think his heroes mythology is kind of a response to that kind of Nietzschean critique, where it says, use this mythology to give your life meaning here in the end of history, and rise up from the couch and go fight the dragons. So
I
do you think that's fair, or
I think his view is actually Nietzschean at the end of the day. I mean, I'm not backing off.
Yes.
I'm not backing off of my previous critiques of Peterson at all. I'm just I'm being a little bit more sympathetic to why he might be making some of the errors he's making, because he just doesn't have the background that I assumed that he did. And I think you can see some of the deep confusion that Peterson has about sacrifice ties into this too. It's interesting, but Yeah, I totally agree with you. Like when they were talking about when he kept talking about, he wanted to talk about like the spirit of power idea, like in the culture, and he doesn't like, he's still looking for an imminent solution to the
I have a
critique of
connection here.
power. He does not understand that there are no finite foundations available from which to overcome the the power critique.
I mean, that is why he finds any critique of Western civilization in Christendom so problematic.
Right.
Is because for him, that is us pulling us up by our bootstraps and doing the best we can and moving forward in sort of slight progress and getting those us awful animal bastards we are. We're sort of pulling us up. And now look at what we've achieved, and these bloody postmodernists want to come along and just tear it all down. And it's a kind of look what we've accomplished. How can you do this? So from that self-justifying vantage point,
it's the materialist evolutionary lens that he continues to use, and it causes him to like, that's one of the walls he's running into, because he's not gonna find that. I think Vervaeke like has the same problem though. Vervaeke didn't help him with that particular problem in this conversation. Like, even though Vervaeke references Girard, like the only thing he gets out of Girard is mimetic theory, and that's it. It's like he misses the part where, like, Girard demonstrates that like Christ is the only lens through which the sacrificial mechanism is revealed. He misses that part.
Hey, Michael, what did you think of the conversation?
I was kind of in the middle. Like, so I've watched it 2 or 3 times now, and the first go through, on the first go through, I was watching 2X on video, and 2 or 1.5, or I was going between those two, and the faces he was making was really off-putting, and some of the things he was saying was really off-putting, especially at that speed. And that kind of colored the way I saw the rest of the conversation. Even though I thought, like, man, they're going over some really interesting material, I was really concerned about Jordan. Like, I was like, Paul in his commentary video said he had poor impulse control. That was the best way to summarize it. He was saying things that were really off-putting, like, the what a dirty bastard I am kind of things. And it wasn't like I don't think he was trying to reveal any darkness. For him, he was genuinely trying to make a joke there, but you could just see his mental cogs weren't working well enough to kind of be present with John there. And so the joke, it just is bad. And you see John react to it is like, no, this is fun. We're having fun. Like he's very concerned by what he's seeing. And his response to it is very telling. He's like, or when he says later, maybe I could justify my own existence. And John's like, very like, no, I feel like there's lots of things that justify your existence. So like, I think those were tells into something going on in him, but Nate was right that it gets a lot better as it goes along. Like I think the conversation was life-giving for him enough that it pulled him into it. And when I watched back at 1X, a lot of the things that I found really off-putting in the first 30 minutes, I realized if you look at Peterson, he just looks incredibly tired. Like he just looks like very haggard. And like some of the times, like when he's trying to pull himself into the conversation, he kind of does do a very shallow word association game. Like with that slouching toward Bethlehem thing you picked up on, Nate. I think that was just like, I think he just did and you could see he almost doesn't want it. He doesn't want to say it because he kind of says it under his breath while John is talking because he's like not sure that it's appropriate or not, but he just kind of throws it in there. Like, again, an example of the poor impulse control. I think he was like really, really tired, but as the conversation went on, he like found something in it that was life-giving enough that he really, I mean, they covered some amazing material. Like and here's the other thing that's a tell for me too, is like, this was recorded months ago. So knowing that makes me less concerned because I've seen one since and like he's he's a lot more with it now. And I think maybe they held this one back because maybe Jordan was a little bit embarrassed by some of like how he came off in it, but now they're like, what the hell? Like, you know,
Right.
the ideas are too important and we're going to have another talk with John anyway. So we need to put this out there. And it was funny, like the tagline that they chose for the conversation was, you know, so intense that it was, you know, almost psychedelic.
Right. Yeah. And I think the reason they talk it psychedelic is because this is okay. To me, this conversation, I like this conversation a lot because this conversation like jumped into the spiritual immediately and stayed there the entire time. Like the only kind of things that are like the psychology and the slight political stuff about like the, you know, the power deconstruction critique, like those were completely secondary. And like they were usually in the context of this larger like attempt to like come to some kind of like spiritual understanding
well, and
of
I
reality.
think that actually gets enhanced by the fact that Jordan mentally isn't all there. And so watching it back at 1X, I was actually really moved because I could see both him and John really, I mean, John was kind of forced into it via the interruptions, but they're really kind of like you see like an embodied wrestling of the philosophia they're talking about. It's like the whole conversation becomes that embodiment, and it's very moving because like for Jordan, he's not talking about ideas. He's like, this is a real struggle of life and death that he sees himself in, and he pulls John into that frame because John is a very empathetic person, and so he pulls John out of the propositional into this, like, I'm wrestling with this life and death thing. Get in here and help me. And I found it very moving.
I think some of the interruptions were intentional too, though, in order to get, because John has a tendency to like information dump at times, and like Peterson was far more interested in advancing the overarching thread of the conversation and didn't want to allow John to get too bogged down in the details the way he can.
And John can become obsessed about citing sources and be
Correct.
like, okay, this isn't my idea, because he has a certain he doesn't want to be wrong, and so he doesn't like and so on points where Jordan kept going, what do you think? And he wanted to like retreat into like, well, so-and-so says this, but Jordan kept pulling him into
keeps throwing him out of it. Yeah, Jordan keeps throwing him out of it. And here's the thing. This is when I like John best. When John gets thrown out of that and he's actually forced to operate more from his intuition, and like, that's when he says the most interesting things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's to throw in some of my jargon to that. That is what Peterson is doing when you're just rapid fire intuiting things. I mean, sure, you're being influenced by things, but that's the difference, I would say, between kind of like this isolated, because a huge thing about this is personalism and individualism. Because like when you're just citing, or you could say like mammonistic knowing versus Eucharistic knowing, when you're just like,
define those for somebody that doesn't know what you mean.
So Eucharistic knowing would be, and I got all this from like the J.P. Marceau Peugeot conversation a long time ago when they were talking about eating an apple. And when you eat an apple, for it to actually give your body energy and become part of you, you have to digest it down, and some of your stomach sloughs off, and there's a give and there's a take. There's a dance. There's a digestive dance that happens between you and the apple in order for that to incorporate into your body. And that's part of communion proper in the Eucharist, is like Christ becomes part of you through the act of eating. Which is participation. Notice that you use dance. Yes. And I like to riff on that though, in terms of knowing, and contrast that to regurgitated knowing. So like you can eat an apple and then you can just throw it back up and bring the apple back up to present to other people, but like it hasn't become part of you. You haven't digested it. You haven't given some of yourself. You haven't actually become one with the apple. It's not yours. And I honestly feel like most conversations, most podcasts, most everything is just people regurgitating facts that they've heard that they don't understand. There's a line from Silence. I reread Silence and I sent it to you guys in the box where the main character, Father Rodriguez, gets into this conversation with one of the people who's interrogating him. And he says, I got the feeling that this person was just using big words that they didn't understand.
Right.
And that can happen when you're just citing things, when you're just saying like these, it's part of what I call depersonalized.
And you have to get thrown out of your map territory in order for that to even become a possibility.
Yes.
Like
so it's like something has to happen to keep you from just like repeating your mapped routine.
Like the conversation with Bishop Barron that Jordan Peterson had in Wave 2 was pretty terrible, honestly.
Yeah, I didn't like it at all.
Especially if you were already pretty familiar with Bishop Barron, you could just tell that he was like, all right, this is a very big platform for me. I have a new audience that I normally don't have. I am going to play my greatest hits regardless of what Jordan really asks me. And he was mainly talking to Jordan's audience through the podcast than he was talking with Jordan on the podcast. And
he wasn't present.
Stale.
There was no sense of presence or participation.
That's anti-personal, actually.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And those conversations, I would say, very technically aren't real. That's non-talking talking.
Yeah.
And to give Jordan a compliment in this conversation, I think that part of Vervaeke was maybe prepared to do something like that. Like he really wanted to get his 4 Ps out there. He's like,
But credit to John that he didn't resist and he like let the conversation become what it became. So John deserves kudos for that, because a lot of people would have been like, this is my chance. This is my platform. I want to get my ideas across. But he was able to like, okay, Jordan wants to do this dance. Let's do this dance.
So here's the thing. I've said this of Vervaeke. This is my criticism of Vervaeke, and I'll throw it in here. Is I ultimately, at the end of the day, John Vervaeke to me is he's one of the highest level, most intelligent, most well-informed of facts and information and knowledge people that are out there. And he can in a very left-brained way, like this is what I would say, John, in a conversation with Paul or with someone else, when he's in like, and I've said this of Paul, when you're like, when Paul's talking to randos, when you're in pastoral mode, when you're in relational mode, there's empathy and there's relationality. And we know we should be doing that when we're talking about ideas too. But like, I think we shift to this idea mode. And John Vervaeke, I think, with Peterson, what I really think was happening, and I feel like John was wrestling with himself in this conversation, because he knew he should be empathetic to Peterson and what he was going through, but he also knew this was a big deal and this is a big platform and I have a lot of ideas, and he was struggling with the Bishop Barron thing we were talking about and with the Sophia dialogos thing. And he knows he should do this, but he really wanted to do this. I think John was having an internal battle.
And I think John did a good job. Like, in Vanderklay's commentary, he focused almost exclusively on Peterson's behavior. And so far, we've almost exclusively focused on Peterson's behavior. But I actually thought that Vervaeke did a really good job, because I could imagine it getting really frustrating.
Right.
Like, even if you are trying to do the Sophia thing, it does help to be able to finish 2 or 3 sentences in a row sometimes. Yeah. But he stayed patient. He didn't let that get under his skin. He kind of adapted to the Jordan Peterson's mood, and he was very empathetic, and he allowed Jordan to take him in a slightly different direction than I think he had mentally prepared for the conversation to go. And he adapted quite quickly. And like, I thought that he did a particularly good job. And honestly, I'd love to be able to talk to Vervaeke afterwards and be like, so what was your impression of that conversation?
Yeah.
What do you think was going on?
I'm really glad that he got him more into his philosopher metaphysician mode and out of his cog sci mode, because he's way more interesting. He's way more interesting when he's in that mode.
Yeah. Listening to Paul's commentary, you could tell that he was kind of offended on behalf of John. He sees John as a friend, and he was kind of some of his negative reaction to Peterson seems to be like he felt bad for John in some way and wanted to, like, I don't know, come across with some sort of defense for John.
Michael, to that point though, this gets at an ultimate belief of like, this gets into my we talk about this a lot, but what is ultimate ontologically, the person or substance? And if you ultimately believe that substance is ultimate, facts, platform, status, getting your ideas out, what is going to be most attractive to people, your ideas or your person? And if you are offended on John's behalf that Jordan wasn't a good enough host to give him a platform, ultimately, I would say that betrays a belief that substance is ultimate and not person.
But there was something a little bit selfish about Peterson's hosting style, where
Sure.
he really, really wanted to almost use Vervaeke, funnel Vervaeke onto his
Teach
own
me.
Teach me,
Yeah.
help me. This is what I want you to talk about. I want you to be right here, right now.
And there's
you're going somewhere else in this direction. No,
So there's this thing about John, right? Though John is a person who is very much has a sense of inner peace and calm. John is very comfortable in his own being. Peterson is not. Peterson wants that. He wants
I don't know if I actually agree with that.
I don't know that I actually agree with that either, because this is the thing I was thinking about Peterson and this is why I like psychoanalysis so much. And even there's I think of it almost as like rooms in a house, like you go into a house, there's a foyer where guests are allowed. And then like there's different rooms of intimacy, and conversationally and relationally, we have the same thing. We have different rooms that we allow other people into ourselves.
Right.
And I think in that conversation, Peterson was just like, this is my bedroom. This is my bathroom. Like, you want all the crazy neuroticism.
Well, and it was kind of unintentional too. He just didn't have the mental bandwidth to put on the proper screen.
But I love that. I'm just like, great. That's like how a conversation with his wife would go if his wife gave a shit about any of that, Like that's why like even in Boxer and even this, sometimes intentionally, people may think it's crass, but sometimes I'll swear because I swear with my wife. I do. To me, it's more of an intimacy thing. Like, I'm not like a sailor or something.
But it does have to do with disinhibited impulse control. That's what swearing is disinhibited impulse control.
Sometimes, like,
but here's the thing, though. The reason for the disinhibited impulse control matters. Was the impulse control disinhibited because he just didn't have the bandwidth, like Michael suggested, or is it because, this is John, he's an old colleague, I can have a real conversation with this person and kind of let my guard down and just be myself?
I think it was a little of both of those. I think
they're not mutually exclusive. It can be both. Yes.
Should we talk about the substance of the conversation?
Sure.
Not yet.
Okay.
I have a couple more thoughts. Like, I do think that and we kind of just alluded to this, I think that part of Jordan Peterson's, like, because he hasn't treated any of his other guests remotely similar to this.
No,
right.
Sure.
This was a total outlier in the tenor of the conversation. Like when he had that North Korean girl on, right? Like she said like 95% of the words in the conversation, and he would just every once in a while transition her to the next phase of her story, right? And keep her going, and maybe a couple sentences about how awful totalitarianism is, and then back to you to keep telling your story, right? And like we could imagine that was recorded within the same month as this Vervaeke conversation, and this is just so completely different from that. And I think part of it is a compliment to John, because Jordan thinks that John, unlike almost anyone he's ever gotten to talk to, can keep up with all of his stuff. Yeah. And that he has perhaps a longer personal relationship with John. Although it's interesting, we got the impression that they haven't actually interacted for like 4 or 5 years. So that's sort of a weird thing. But you can imagine maybe before when they were back just kind of low status professors at the University of Toronto, this is what like the faculty lounge in the psychology department looked like or something like that. But there was something of a compliment to John, I think, in the way that Jordan just unleashed on him in a way, because he trusted that John could take it and follow it, unlike even Peugeot, right? He didn't do this with Peugeot. He was very emotionally vulnerable with Peugeot.
Yeah. Yep.
Yes.
But he was not this fast-paced, frenetic, intellectual fire hose with
Sam,
Peugeot.
when you said that in the box, and I fully agree with that. This is the first time, because I experienced that with certain people. Like you said something like this was his first dance partner that he felt like he could really let loose with. And I feel like you could almost think of that because wrestling was such a metaphor they used in there.
Yeah.
That it's like if I were
right.
wrestling with someone, like it's different if I'm wrestling with
and
my
what's
son.
going to make and what's going to make the best wrestling match? When you have two people who are equally matched in skill.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Then that's when the magic really happens, right? That's when the wrestling match can really be
and they both have
a
good
wrestling
technique.
match. Right, exactly. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So
and you could really hear a longing that Peterson had for his loss of the academic life. That and I think some of like it was kind of off-putting, but he kept saying like man over and over again. I felt like that was an attempt to kind of force a sort of return to an intimacy that was gone for him. Like we're okay, like
think
trying
about
to
that idea, man.
I think they did both use the term friend too in this conversation. So it's like I think
they definitely, when they were way back when they definitely had some really intense conversations at some point.
Yeah.
That he was drawing on there, but it felt kind of, it just, again, it was like poor. It just didn't land well to the outsider, but I think it was Peterson wanting to have a greater intimacy and trying to kind of pull back into like a more informal kind of mode of conversing.
Yeah.
All right. Do we want to watch part of the video? Do we want to watch the Heidegger stuff? That was Julian's idea, and Julian's gone. So I think that I might just kind of pick randomly different.
I actually do have a part that I'm interested in. There's a part where Peterson goes on this very odd riff about like.
Well, that's not very specific.
Well, he talked about us being holographic in relation to distributed cognitive net and canonic vessels for the whole.
Put that on a t-shirt, Nate.
Yeah, right. A canonic representation of this spirit. Yeah.
So that was a thing that happened 4 or 5 times throughout the conversation where they talked about putting things on a t-shirt. What in the world was that? Like
I think he just
was Peterson every time too.
Oh, it was.
Was that a joke from like maybe like how there's the pre-recorded part of the conversation where you warm up a little bit and then you turn on the microphones? Maybe
I don't think
like
it was a
in
callback.
Or maybe it was maybe it was a thing they used to talk about back in the day. Who knows?
Yeah,
some inside joke. I don't think it was a callback. I think what it was like, I think he was poking fun at the platitude level understanding of things. Like, because Vervaeke would say something that was so infinitely dense, that you could have made, a 20-hour lecture series on. And I think Jordan would just say, put that on a t-shirt. Like it's simple to convey what he's getting at. I think that's
like you could almost imagine a sentence in the pre-recorded part of the conversation where Vervaeke says something like, well, it's hard for me to put my ideas so simply that they could fit on a t-shirt. Right. Mm-hmm. And Jordan being like, oh, well, maybe I'll help you do that. This conversation,
right?
And then 4 or 5 times throughout the conversation,
that
Jordan
was
being
a
like,
very
there's the t-shirt line. Or maybe that's what we'll put on the t-shirt. But again, in his way of not really doing an excellent job of keeping track of what the audience would be in on and what they wouldn't be in on, and just his, the top of the head manicness, that just kept popping.
But this is
out.
the thing, Sam, about that. Like, I agree with you. You are, so for example, you're an excellent host in a podcast, I think. Like, even the way that you do this, I sit here and observe you just keeping track of things and directing things, and I think you're very gifted at it.
I don't think
part of what just let me finish.
Okay, go for it. Sorry, Luke.
Part of what the like, even when you were saying he wasn't doing a good job thinking of how the audience would perceive it, that requires disintegration. To do that, you have to disintegrate yourself to think about, what is my audience going to be thinking about this? That detracts you from the at one-ment. And Peterson just wasn't doing that at all. And yes, was it spastic? Sure. I don't mind it though.
I don't think you really care if you can say things like, imagine we are holographic to a distributed cognitive net without explaining what you mean.
All right.
And act as if that requires no explanation.
And to use the word kenotic, which I only know from Philippians 2, what that means.
Right. And that
Not
and that we're
kenosis.
canonic to it. And then later on, he actually comes back around to it and he says, since you agree with me that we're canonic representations of this thing I'm talking about.
Listen, I had never heard of henosis either, but I think henosis is kenosis is a great line. So there we go.
Wait a minute. They weren't saying kenotic, they were saying henotic?
No.
Later,
Vervaeke, when he said it the second time, Vervaeke brought up henosis.
And what's henosis? Is that pleasure something?
No, henosis is like in Neoplatonism, it's like the completion of the
okay, all right.
So where you're actually like
the final step
with
of
the Platonic
ascent.
one, where you
Kenosis by kenosis. That's better. There you go.
Yeah. Where was the Trinity part of the conversation? Because that of course was obviously the part that I found most interesting. It was relatively early on.
Which one?
Like where Jordan Peterson was like in, a super fragmented way trying to, propose his solution to the doctrine of the Trinity. And Vervaeke was talking about the 3-leveled Platonic ascent. Right. And he's like, well, maybe this is the Trinity you're looking for? But then they like moved on to.
So this is the
else.
Collective intelligence, the spirit, psychological and logos intimacy, and the Trinity is 2030.
All right.
There you go. So yeah, that's probably it.
Okay, let's give that a whirl. All right, hopefully this will work on the recording. Let me just check a couple of the settings. Let me make sure that I don't divulge any work protected data on my computer. All right, here we go. Stop me quickly if the audio isn't working or something.
FORD, Cornford.
It's quiet.
The idea there is that the sort of soul flight practices within shamanism are taken up into Pythagoras' notion of soul flight.
Yeah, well, I imagine the soul flight practices are the same thing as the Eleusinian mysteries, essentially. They're a continuation of the shamanic tradition into the present. Yeah, well, that's the thesis of this book, anyways.
What's interesting to me is, that Plato represents Socrates as being able to bring about that state in people through dialogue alone. I know what that means. Yeah.
And so do you.
Yeah, very much. And when I see people in these practices, what happens is they first orient on each other, then they orient on the logos. They find an intimacy with the logos. And then
what do you mean by that?
Well, what they do is they come to find that they're not only in relationship to each other, they're in relationship to this Geist or logos that's happening in the distributed cognition. I mean,
okay. So that's a very interesting way of phrasing it. So that's what I see as the spirit that's guiding the golden thread. And that's what you're praying to when you ask for a revelatory thought when you're confused. So imagine that imagine we're holographic in relationship to this distributed cognitive net, right? So the part contains some of the whole.
Very much.
And the whole would be this distributed spirit that you're just describing, at least as it's enacted. And so insofar as you're a holographic, minuscule, but complete in some sense, kenotic representation of this spirit, you can ask it for it to bestow its wisdom on you. And its operation in your unconscious produces the revelatory thought.
Okay, well, that is deeply converging with a lot of the cog psi that I'm bringing to it.
Good.
Okay, so the idea here is that distributed cognition has a property, collective intelligence, that is something that is not just the sum of individual intelligences, and there's increasing evidence for this.
Yeah, well, you can imagine, sorry, I'm prone to do this, but you can imagine it's like reading a book. I mean, I have this distributed spirit in my head, plus I have my own experience. And so I'm the combination of that distributed spirit and my own.
Well, yeah, that's the extended mind.
So that's probably what the Son is, John, in the Trinitarian spirit, is that combination, because that's an incarnation of the spirit in a particular time and place. Well, and that's what I bring to the dialogue.
Well, that's good. Let's play with that. I like serious play. I think that's how we go through.
Okay. Well, so we've got the father as that distributed entity that stretches back in time.
Well, no, you see, let's play with that, because let me first try something, and then let's see if it maps in, because people get into. They start to realize that the presence of the collective intelligence above and beyond the presence of Tom and Sue and Anne. Right. And then they start to enter into relationship with that. But then there's a further thing that happens. And this, I think, might point to what you're. Okay,
so maybe that's the spirit, that thing that's inhabiting everybody at that time, right? So it's akin to the Son and it's akin to the Father, but it constitutes that distributed space.
And so what I think might I think of it as the Neoplatonic one, and that would correspond, right? And so
that's your peculiarity.
Yeah, we'll come back to why I think that language is helpful. I'm not claiming it's exclusive. I'm not doing that.
Hey, I'm not claiming it's not helpful either.
So what they do is they get to a place where, and not everybody does this, because you can imagine it depends.
What did you just say? Not everybody does this? Well, no, put that on a T-shirt.
What I mean is that
I noticed that, John.
Most people that are doing the circling, they don't. Many of them are happy just with what you might call the psychological intimacy. Then
yes, no wonder.
Yep, and then some people move to what you might call logos intimacy, and then some people move through that, and by means of it, to an intimacy of what is the fount of that, what is the ground of that, what is it about the reality that makes this kind of thing possible. They start to think of it.
So they're reflecting on it.
They're reflecting on it.
Like we're doing. Is that?
Yeah, very much. And you can think about this kind of move. And for me, this is where the prototypical Socratic Platonic move comes, where you get the idea that the very process of intelligibility gives you is the most profound access we have to the way reality is realizing itself. And that's how people start to talk. They start to talk about reality, but beyond the we space. So there's us, the we space, and then the reality. And maybe that corresponds better with the Trinity that you're looking for.
Well, I think you probably lost me to some degree with that last.
All right, I'll stop it there.
So I just want to point out real quick, like his laughter was off.
Yes.
Everybody picked up on that, right?
Yeah, it was socially inappropriate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Like, and I think it was like a sort of tired. I don't know. I don't know what to put it on, or maybe new med or something, but something physically is going off there. And I can imagine that why maybe they didn't want to publish this until later, because of, that was. I mean, it's anybody that watches this had to have been edited by somebody. So somebody looked at this and maybe they thought it was a little off-putting. But not to derail from the ideas, but that was because he's lucid when he's talking, but then he has these little slips.
Yeah. I also think that if they do another conversation, they should go over to each other's house and do it in person, right? They both live in Toronto, presumably. So
yeah,
I think that part of me wonders if there was any internet lag that could sometimes contribute to a proneness to interrupt more than, actual sitting next to each other sort of thing. So I think I say next time they talk, they should be in the same house. But
Peterson invited him over. He said he should come see he invited him in the context of talking about the carving.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So boy, there's a lot to there. And then right after that, basically Vervaeke goes on shortly after that to basically regurgitate St. Augustine, and then say, but I don't think it makes any sense to talk about this as a Trinity. So yeah.
So it's funny, I've listened to that part a couple times now, and there's just so much in it that I think I heard it better this time than I've heard it the previous times. So it's they're talking about like the shared like spiritual mental realm that's sort of like this blobby golden thread that's like moving through history.
So what's interesting to me about this, Sam, is that like Peterson is the one who kind of keeps wanting to link it to spirit. And Vervaeke keeps wanting to bring it back to collective intelligence. Like his cognitive scientist mode wants to. Peterson is much more inclined to want to talk about it in sort of like spiritual sort of terms. He wants to, and he'll say it as, he'll talk about it as collective too, but he'll also like, maybe this is something like spirit. So it's like he's like much more open to talking about it in like what would be considered spiritual language.
Although, why doesn't Vervaeke just turn on his Neoplatonic terminology and he could call it like the world?
Because he's an avowed physicalist.
Right.
Yeah.
He can't go there because that's the thing. It's really, we've been increasingly talking about this on the Voxer, but the personalism, individualism is huge, that distinction. And the individualism, he goes there because that individualism and collectivism are rooted in materialism. And so like, and then all you have is stuff like emergence. But if you have this kind of personalism and you have some kind of transcendent personalism that is present in everything, you know, in him we live and move and have our being, then you're stuck with something like panpsychism.
No, but that's important because remember, this also comes out, you're right, Luke, and like I think that like Vervaeke seems to want to go like right from the individual to the collective, right, and miss the personal space, and that comes out in like a little bit of their conversation about like personality and personality theory and cognitive theory, like and Vervaeke like says that he's working on a way to kind of like bring those into conversation, but Peterson is much more tied to like the inability to separate the, you know, cognition from the idea of person.
Which is
so
good. Did anybody see the Vervaeke Kastrup conversations?
No, I did not.
Okay. Yeah, I saw the first one. It was pretty good. I mean, but it was interesting because they have this, there's obviously a lot of mutual respect there, but they have this hard line, which is that physicalist line that Vervaeke wants to hold.
Right. Even though he's intrigued by it because
Bernardo Kastrup, I think he's Brazilian, but he's got all the it's not really panpsychism, but it is like a sort of I don't know what he calls it. It's some sort of realism.
Yeah,
Vervaeke mentions it in the conversation.
He believes that consciousness is.
Oh, it's idealism. It's a form of idealism.
That right. Kastrup, that's a form of idealism. He believes that consciousness is primary.
And Kastrup, I've always had a hard time understanding, but he did a conversation with Mark Vernon recently, which I thought was the best I was able to understand, and was in that conversation.
Wasn't there some like recently, I put this in the box and I can't remember what they called it, but it was that substantive realism, or what was it?
Speculative realism.
Speculative realism. So like Vervaeke because I just kept copying exactly what Vervaeke was saying in these little chunks throughout the conversation. And I'm just like, how is this not Trinitarian theology? Like, I just don't understand. Like, and you want to be a physicalist, but like, how do you, there is no grounding for that.
Okay, so the most Trinitarian thing he says is when he starts talking about love, right? And he starts talking about how you have like this kenotic love where the lover and beloved make space for each other and right, and fully inhabit one another. And then you also have this third thing, which is that's Augustine's language, and it's like, but I don't think you need to separate them, is what he says. It's just kind of like all one thing. Well, yeah, but that's what the idea of the Trinity says. You don't separate them.
Weird.
It has the properties of oneness and threeness, but it's not quantitative.
And the other place where Vervaeke gave some, he talked, when he was talking about circling, right? He says, some of the people who do circling experience psychological intimacy with each other. And Jordan Peterson says something like, well, I'm sure they like that. Or, you know, it's one of his weird interjections.
I think that actually was a reference to them both being psychologists. Mm-hmm. I think that's what that was. It's like, Fair enough. Understanding people, like he was referencing the psychological dialogue.
Yeah.
That's what I think he meant.
That would make sense. So, right. Yeah. So like, this circling practice, like level 1 enlightenment is the psychological intimacy that you get from doing it. And then like level 2 intimacy was like logos intimacy, right? Where they're talking about the reasons or something like that, why it works. And then like level 3 enlightenment was like realizing the oneness behind it. And that was like when Vervaeke was at his most Neoplatonic, right?
Yep.
Because that's the Neoplatonic triad, the Neoplatonic ascent, right? Is where you go from, you know, the world soul to the world mind to the one, right? And that was sort of, you know, Vervaeke's, is this the Trinity you're looking for, right? sort of thing. But Peterson is doing so like that is like, you know, some Christians mapped that very quickly, you know, the Father is the one, the Son is the Logos, and the Spirit is the world soul. And that's honestly what Arianism is. And but Jordan Peterson wants to do the Augustinian Trinitarian thing, right? The internal psychologized three things that kind of operate as one thing.
And then Vervaeke kind of very explicitly brings out that language and then backs away from it.
Yeah.
Without explanation.
It's like he doesn't want to help Jordan be too Christian or something.
Right, exactly. It's like, yeah, he just like, his reasons for pulling away from it are really vague. It's like,
but we think we know what they are, don't we? The cartoons.
Yeah. Or I thought it was just a reticence to be too Christian. And that's another thing that we could talk about is like, what's the role of Christianity in Jordan? What's the role of Christianity in John? And what's the source of tension there? Because neither of them go to church. Neither of them are like, you know, go out on the street and wear a t-shirt that says, I am a Christian. But you know, Jordan seems closer and more willing to kind of identify with Christianity in his own way than Vervaeke is. And I'm not quite sure. I think
Jordan's more aware of the inevitability of Christianity within our cultural frame. And I think that's, I think Jordan just senses that we can't get away from it and there's no point in resisting it.
Right. And I think John doesn't want to be exclusive, right? That came up.
John doesn't want to be exclusive, right? So this is, yeah, right, exactly. So this has a lot to do with, this is actually connected to their political values, I think. Which is one of their sources of disagreement. And it's like, I think John prefers the Platonic language because he sees it as less divisive.
Yeah. And accessible to everyone.
Even though the way he talks about Platonism, it's like, you actually only get that from like Christian Neoplatonists, like who you trying to get.
And the desire not to be exclusivist.
Right. But like, here's the thing.
That's only found in Christianity. I mean,
yes, there's a way to be exclusivist and exclusive. I mean, if you're a Christian universalist, perennialist, who acknowledges, so like there is exclusivity in Christ because that's the only place there's life or salvation or anything, and it's fully manifest and incarnated in Jesus Christ. So it is exclusive in that regard, but it's also universal because nobody else who's breathing is breathing apart from Christ. I mean, listen to the David Bentley Hart, Rupert Sheldrake conversation on Roland and Moonlight. All life is in Christ.
Hey, don't jump the gun. One conversation at a time, Luke.
Well, I understand that, but I'm just saying, like, part of what I think, part of what I get frustrated about, and I think this is tied, I'm going to bring up Nathan Jacobs and reaching the nuns, because I think this is connected to the nuns. People, and it's connected to personalism. People, particularly in the West, because, well, that's most of the, because it's been globalized now through technology, reject personal religion because it's Cartesian, it's hyper masculine, because it's so cataphatic and assertive. Like you have to believe this and this and this and this and this, and there's no mystery, there's no nuance. There's like, it's ideological, it's a bounded set. Like it has to be this stuff, and it's legal and it's punitive. And people reject that because they're like, that's gross, that's ugly. I grew up with guilt and shame and fear my whole life. But guess what? That's not Christianity.
Right. And see, Jordan seems to be more open to the idea of seeing a Christianity that isn't defined in those terms. And Vervaeke it's interesting that like the theism that he resists is explicitly it's a Christian, it's a Christian kind of theism, but
Right.
that he's resisting, because
another interesting thing,
he's quite explicit. He's quite explicit that it's the post-Cartesian, modernist kind of theism that he is resistant to.
Yeah.
So that means that even in his desire to be inclusive, he's really kind of picking on a particular Christian frame as like the thing that he's resisting.
So a difference between Vervaeke and Peterson. So Vervaeke grew up kind of fundamentalist Christian, right?
That's pretty obvious.
Right. And he said that, right? Like he said that to Paul. He said that to me, that he grew up in some sort of fundamentalist kind of Christianity that was very apocalyptic. Although a non-charismatic, apocalyptic, very I don't know,
probably reform adjacent, based on
probably
his specific, especially based on the way he dunks on the theology of the will toward the end of this conversation. I think that's definitely the case.
And whereas Peterson grew up at best a nominal Christian, right? Like maybe an Easter Christmas liberal Christian or something like that. And even then a nominal Christian, right? And so he doesn't have much exposure to like actually being in a church that's very tight-knit and very intense. Well, whereas Vervaeke does.
One quick ad, Sam. The nominal thing, the reason that people don't grow up so jaded and broken who grow up nominal is because nominal Christian practice, the mainline Christian practice, isn't obsessively dogmatic about believing these hyper punitive legal things.
Well, that's part of it. I'll also point out that they're Calvinist, which is, I'll say the C word. Nominal liberal Christianity is just as Calvinist as the Vervaeke
just as puritanical form. And stuff. Yeah.
It comes from the Puritan strain,
but it's implicit and it's more chill than like the.
So I'm just saying, not all Calvinists was
right. No, yeah. Actually, I was actually talking about this earlier. How I think that like John has a particular aversion to that particular like strain for sure, but like when the way he talked, like what he's objecting to, it actually applies to all kinds of things that are kind of within this basically post-Reformation kind of theological tradition that embraces like this modernist post-Cartesian frame.
But John
it covers a broad base of theology.
Yeah. But while Vervaeke is very intimately aware of the Christianity that he grew up in, he's also very aware of other kinds of Christianity, right? Like he gets Pajot, he's read lots of different theologians and postmodern theologians and stuff like that. So it's not like he is unaware of the breadth of the variety of Christianity, but he still seems particularly
right. I'm glad you brought that up, because what do you think, Sam? What do you think Pajot means when he said, or excuse me, what do you think that Vervaeke means when he says that Pajot is a more radical kind of Christian than he?
Because he agrees with him, he's a heretic. Therefore, it's his own version of Christianity, I think, that comes in there. It's like, okay, whatever he is, it's really. Pajot doesn't know it, but he's actually outside the circle of the thing I don't like. So therefore he's okay.
Or he's just orthodox.
No, I think that he's worried that Pajot's ideas taken to something like what Vervaeke would understand as their logical conclusion is like a fundamentalism that's even more fundamentalist than the kind he grew up in. Like I think that Vervaeke worries that inside Pajot is like make Christianity Constantinople again, right? With a monarchy and a Christian empire, and
that isn't him.
It's similar to Julian's concerns.
Yeah.
Pajot needs a healthy dose of Christian anarchism, because we're teasing our Constantine. His projection of the heavenly hierarchy, which I could also agree with him about, down to the earthly level, is a big mistake.
Right, and I think that is part of what John means, that Pajot is more radical of a Christian than he realizes.
I felt like he was using it in a positive sense.
I do too.
It did seem like he meant it in a positive sense, but
it's specifically to distinguish it from the brands of Christianity he doesn't like.
Right. I agree. I think, Sam, what you're saying is true, but in the context of the conversation, it felt positive.
Yeah, I think you're right with your observations.
I actually have a particular notion of what it is, because like Pajot, he backs away from it, but Pajot, I know Pajot has read Rene Guénon, and he does say some things sometimes that kind of like lean very closely into sort of a Christian perennialism. And it's that specifically that perennialist element that the Neoplatonist John sees like, hey, that sounds like my thing.
Right.
That's like,
but hey, keep reading Max the Confessor, keep reading Pseudo Dionysius, right? That's the hyper Neoplatonic version of Christianity that permeates part of Eastern Orthodoxy that Vervaeke likes. But right. There's also some implications of that Vervaeke really, really, really doesn't like.
Correct. What doesn't he like?
Christian empire-based nationalism, theocratic monarchy.
Right, but I'm in that camp, and I don't advocate any of that stuff. And maybe
but
that's.
I think Pajot, if you got him to be honest, kind of does though, right?
He does.
He does.
No, I think he's been quite explicit about the fact that he's a monarchist.
But that's because Pajot, I think, misunderstands. He conflates hierarchy. This is, I mean, we've talked about this in the box.
Constantine himself didn't make the mistake Pajot makes. Constantine waited until his deathbed to convert because he understood what was at issue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a good point, Nate. But I think there's the difference between earthly hierarchy and heavenly hierarchy, and they're not the same thing. So if you're gonna try to take, I mean, and to me the New Testament seems pretty clear about this. I don't know. I would love to talk to Pajot about this, because you can't take the ways of the world, the ways that power is manifested in the world, which is lording it over, is not the heavenly hierarchy. The heavenly hierarchy is the higher serves the lower.
And Peterson is guilty of the same error in his own way that Pajot is.
It's something like the naturalistic fallacy or something like that. Or something like that which is in the heavenly hierarchy is that which ought now be on earth, or something like that. I don't know.
Well, it should be, but not in an earthly way. That's what Jesus did. Jesus was higher, and he washed the disciples' feet. That's the heavenly hierarchy manifest in an earthly way, but it's not earthly power.
It's an inversion of it.
Yes.
I don't know if I agree with the inversion, because here's the question: like, okay, does your head serve the rest of your body?
Yeah,
exactly. That's the way reality lays itself out. Is what Pajot describes as the higher always has to serve the lower, and if the higher doesn't serve the lower, the higher goes away really quickly.
Right,
it gets taken out.
But it doesn't dominate the lower. So in your body, it's all functioning properly. Your head is still your head. It is still primary.
But it's always in contrast.
I have too much Douglas Harding in my brain to even.
Well, the head.
It's like, what head?
Right. Well, he's just.
You're just an open awareness. What are you talking about? Head.
He's talking about ego.
Well, here's the other thing too. Okay, let's say you're in a fight and you decided, well, it doesn't matter. You know, you thought it was just as important if your little finger got hurt as if your head got hurt. You would go down in that fight right away. The head is more important than your little finger. If you're going to sacrifice something, you sacrifice the little finger, and that is.
I don't think both those things are. I don't think you're following what I said when it was an inversion. What I'm saying is
Pajot's point, though, is
the principle of power. No, the principle of power itself is what is inverted. This Pajot always thinks that that the options are either it's either hierarchy or revolution, and there's nothing in between. He can't see any inversion other than the sort of postmodernist leftist inversion, which just wants to change who's on top of the hierarchy.
And this is why he hates America.
The inversion that Christ shows us is it inverts the understanding of what power is. Power, what is really power, is self-sacrifice. Self-sacrifice is the power. It's so powerful, it creates a universe from nothing.
Yes, agreed. But Michael's talking about something else, I think.
I'm saying Pajot's point is that's the pattern. That's being itself. All being follows that pattern. It to not follow that pattern is to fall out of being completely.
Right, but we have that's the fall. So.
And yet we're still here.
You can't fix that. you can't fix it within the immanent frame. You can't just, there's,
I'm not talking about fixes. I'm just talking about Paget's point is, which is that all reality follows this. That we've in our propositions, we've taken characteristics of it out of context.
But we don't follow it. We invert it. We want to. We do the opposite. Rather than self-sacrifice, we want to sacrifice the other in order to have the peace of Caesar instead of the peace of God.
Yeah, but I think you guys are talking past each other, because I think what Michael is saying is in reality, because we live in this place where it's the separation of the waters. There's this.
What I'm saying is, like, even a satanic hierarchy has to emulate Christ, or it immediately dissembles into non-being.
Mm-hmm. Right, because if
the
it's
house
not
divided against itself, can't stand.
Now, it has to. You know, it's always going to have that satanic element, but it also, if it decided, it can't just be pure evil. Pure evil doesn't exist ontologically. It has to emulate the good.
It has to really offer peace.
Yeah,
or
it parasitizes good.
It's a false
to
peace.
accomplish its goals.
It's a peace that is merely a cessation of war, right? So it's not a real peace. It's not a lasting peace, but it does have to offer peace.
So Peterson and Vervaeke and Peugeot being a more radical Christian, I think that we're starting to get into the topic of the Constantine conversation, which I am excited for, and we need Julian to do properly.
For sure.
But so I guess I think that Vervaeke is worried about Peugeot's form of Christianity because it has all of the exclusiveness, and perhaps almost even in a certain sense more exclusiveness than the kind of Baptist-ish fundamentalism maybe that Vervaeke himself grew up in, which was very, sectarian, and thought, probably, we're the only ones with the truth, and we know when Jesus is going to come back, or something like that. And Vervaeke very much values non-exclusivism, but even then, like his circling practices, you still have to participate in the circle together, right? You still have to be part of a body together. You need to say, this is the body that we're a part of, and this is how you cooperate in it. And at the end of the day, I really don't see how that's going to get him something that's less exclusive than saying everything that needs to be to survive needs to be in Christ or something like that. So I think that he thinks that it's something like he thinks that propositional knowledge is less exclusive than maybe the focusing on participatory knowledge or something like that. And that Neoplatonism is a little bit more intellectually inviting, I guess, because it is based more on rationality than, I don't know, faith or revelation or something like that in his mind. And that he thinks that it can get around Christianity's exclusivism problem that way. But at the end of the day, I really don't think that it does. And I think that Peterson realizes something that Vervaeke doesn't, that the inevitability of the Christian inheritance or something like that, and that it'll have to point to things that have names on it rather than things that could have any name on it, I guess would be the way I would put it.
So I didn't fully follow all that, but I mean, to me, it's what Vervaeke is, his rejection of the post-Cartesian thing is that I don't know exactly why he's upset or why he's fearful, because I agree with you to some degree of like the Constantinian being a king thing of Peugeot, but I think if I sat down with Vervaeke, what I would ask him is like, I don't understand why you are leery of Christianity, especially a Christianity that wouldn't acknowledge that belief in God and faith isn't equated to a conscious assent to abstract propositions. Like that isn't what faith is. And Vervaeke knows that. I mean, they talked about that a bunch throughout.
Yeah, they critique propositionalism a lot, but Vervaeke always circles back around to try to recover it, though. Mm-hmm. And if you look at his community, boy, is that a propositionalist community. He doesn't ever fully let it go.
And that's because I think that he thinks that reason and science are more inviting and a better provide a better shared mutual ground than faith.
Right.
So
and he
ironically, he still
right.
likes a propositionalism because he thinks that it doesn't require, I don't know, the sort of Kierkegaardian kind of blind leap of faith sort of thing.
Right. He doesn't want to give up on finding some finite foundation. Like that's like, he's like, that's why he's still at the end of the day, like he's a non-reductive materialist, but he's still a materialist.
He thinks he can do it. He thinks he can do it in a collectivist way.
Correct. He finds he can think. Right, which is why he's always talking about that 3D, that global map. Yeah, yes, exactly. This is why he ends up leaning into collectivism.
Yeah, I ranted on that in the Boxer thing. Like
Peterson has a tendency. Peterson has a tendency in his politics to like lean too hard into the individualism, and it's like, although I think Peterson is like, it seems to be like he's gradually moving into like he's kind of discovering this sort of like intermediary personalist space like more and more, and I think his searching for like understanding of the Trinity is a sign of that. Right, because when you're searching for the Trinity, that to me says that you're starting to glimpse, and this, I don't know if this came before or after the McGilchrist conversation, but it suggests that you're starting to understand how correlation is to reality. And once you understand that, then like the personalist vision starts to come into the frame.
Especially if you're searching for an Augustinian Trinity. But anyway.
Yes. Right. Yes. Yes.
And Peterson's really influenced by Jung, who's when Jung's idea of individuation is really, it is more personalist, because in some sense you are becoming more connected to the whole,
right,
as you're becoming an individual. Right. And in that Castrop Vernon conversation, they went through that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right.
The more personal you are, the more you lean into yourself. I mean, and this is
the idea that only the saints are real people.
Right. And that's my favorite Calvin quote. Like, there is no knowledge of God without knowledge of self. And the two are closely intertwined, and you don't get one without the other. That's essentially personal, like a personalist.
Well, that intimacy of God is what he's talking about when he says, imagine we are holographic in relation to this distributive cognitive net. Like, that's what he's talking about. Like, to him, like that distributed cognitive net, the consciousness, the awareness that is above our own awareness, that's what God is to him.
But the problem with like the map to the globe or the distributive cognitive net is cognition is always fundamentally individualist. Cognition is fundamentalist. It's fundamental. It is, well, it's fundamentalist too. Sorry, that was a Freudian slip, I guess.
Right, but that's why Peterson is. But Peterson understands that tension between the unity and the multiplicity, which is why he's looking to map the Trinity. And because the ultimately Vervaeke's view leans toward collectivism, that's why he's like more interested in the Platonic one as his model. That's part of what's going on in the tension.
But that has to be, again, that has to be mystical. It can't be cognitive, because cognitive is going to be individualist and map.
I hold your breath, and I wouldn't hold my breath and wait for Vervaeke to. I mean, he's a cognitive scientist. I don't think he's ever going to embrace it on mystical terms.
Well, but here's the thing: is like he knows he should. He just won't. Maybe, I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe if he keeps talking to Pajot, we'll see. I mean, I critique Pajot's tendency toward Constantinism, but other than that, I like everything he says.
So, like, this is the question though? This is listening to that whole conversation, everything they say, and then like the infinite is in the finite, and I mean, they kept saying all this stuff that was Trinitarian and iconic, and he affirms icons versus images and idols, and like all of that was perfect. Like, the one is propaganda, the one is art. All of that is great. But how can you critique Cartesian religion and contrast that with theology? With like, what did he contrast it with? Cartesian religion versus a theological viewpoint, and not understand that cognition is ultimately still rooted in propositionalism. You're still stuck in a prison made of thoughts. Like, how can you not see that? I just don't get it.
Well,
like,
parts of them,
smart.
Yeah, I know. And at times he sounds like he gets it, but then it's like, for whatever reason, it's like he wants to recover. And I'll tell you what it is, because he says this all the time. It's like, he talks about error correction and he talks about not falling for the bullshit. It's like, that's the thing that keeps him from leaning full into the mystical vision, is the fear of being wrong. And the fear of like, and the fear of the damage that can be done by others who engage in deception.
I would have thought that it's something like he still wants to be respected in the faculty lounge and still be able to write.
Obviously, that's of course. Like status and his profession are definitely a part of that too. Yeah.
See, this is the thing, and if you really believe in something like dialogos, I said this in the Voxer the other day. I increasingly, and I said this to like, I hope we have a in real life meeting with all of this little corner community and randos and Paul. And I like Paul. I really do like him. I'm less and less interested in ever having a conversation with him about ideas, because most of that is bullshit. Most of that is egoic bumper cars. I have zero interest in it. And that's ultimately where I think all these guys are still in a propositional status, earthly mode of facts and knowledge, because it's impersonal. I would way rather talk to you guys all day, because in my opinion, these conversations are real. This is Sophia. This is dialogos. All that other stuff, for all of your nuance and for all of your saying the opposite, is philonikeia, and it's about ego, and it's about status, and it's about building your platform, and it's about brand, and it's mammon. And I'm sick of it. Really sick of it. Drives me crazy.
Well, I don't know that. I mean, just to give. I mean, I think you're always forced to be, you're always doing a little bit of both, right? And like, you're always striving towards the one. The question is, which one, what are you holding up in front of you that you're trying to move towards? And I feel like there's the pull of both all the time. Like, even in a conversation like this, we're trying our best, to pull each other towards whatever we think is that good, but it's, it's tough. And
how do you see the difference in yourself?
I don't know that you really can. I think like the best way is to actually to look outside yourself and see how you're being reflected back from other people,
Yeah.
I don't know.
And
which is
I think
that's about that kenotic making of space.
I think one of the things that they said that was interesting is even philia nokia has its appropriate space and use too. Right.
And the one can lead into the other. If here's the thing, anything you try to do really well, if you're focused enough on trying to do it well, it will lead into that deeper thing, because you'll eventually think you'll find, well, why is this better than this? Why is this better? And that will lead to some meta principle of the good, always, and no matter what the domain of inquiry is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I think, here's the thing though. It's like, even when it's like there's a certain like way, like even when we're doing evil, that like inevitably there's a way that even that the evil that we do, like it's being born into reality, like still makes it like participate in the good as a lesser good.
Agreed.
That's like, I don't know if anybody read that essay I linked that was on like the chaotic beauty of Walter White by Jonathan Heaps from the Church Life Journal.
I got about 30% through it. It's really good on like on reflecting on like that, on how like, even though like evil is like is ontologically like associated with non-being, that because of our embodied existence, even when we do evil, like there's a way in which like it becomes like just like a really low on the hierarchy version of the good. Yeah,
because it can't become evil in the absolute sense.
Yeah, I mean, this is the point I was making earlier about the hierarchies. Like, and Jordan was pointing to, he's talking about the show Suits, which is about lawyers, which are like, it's like the epitome of a satanic hierarchy, right? Like, but even in the midst of that, something they're trying to do philo-Nicaea, but it moves into philosophia, and to the degree to which they do that is what he said is how the characters become tolerable to us as viewers.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and this is, and I've said this before. I've never said it to you directly, but I've said it through the Vox, Michael. It's why I've been so thankful, and I've been sorry, I'm jumping ahead. It's why I've been so thankful of your pushback on my critique of technology and my whole techno babble thing, because I think this is true, and I think it's actually really, really important in the whole redemptive arc of what God is doing, incarnation, and who God even is himself, and the cross and the resurrection, is that what you meant for evil, God meant for good, all the way back to Joseph, being sold into slavery and the saving of Egypt and Israel. But God's doing that all the time with everything. He's doing that through technology. Like there's a lot of evil that's happening through technology, and God is just, we talked about in the Voxer, as God is, like, he's not a dummy with Job. Even with Job, Satan comes in and is like, like, you can't do it. And God's just like, how about Job? Like, no. God is never, he's such a good, it's like judo. He's doing.
That's what I was saying in that box. Like, it's like the judo flip. He picks like the least of these, and then the least of these does a little judo flip against the powers that be, and shows that they have no power.
How about there
was a really powerful point in there in what you said about like where you value Michael's pushback, and I know you mean that. And it's like that's the thing, like that right there. It's like there's a way in which, like, in order for us to have a really genuinely truly personalist relationship, right? If we're going to really live into a personalist spirit, like if there's going to be actual love, then that doesn't mean just agreeing all the time, right?
No,
it doesn't mean just affirmation, always affirmation.
Unity and multiplicity.
Right, exactly. And I think so that's where there's still room for that. And I think, that's all I wanted to say.
This is why guys fight and then they become friends afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had that happen a lot.
So how about this verse? Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And the word overcome is Nikia, right?
Yeah.
Do not be Nikia'd by evil, but Nikia evil with good. So even Philea Nokia has its place.
Yes.
But how do you overcome it? You overcome evil with good.
Yeah, and you take it on. I mean, you take on the evil. I mean, that's I don't know. It just Jesus being the perfect example of
which is why there has to be a role for propositions, but it can't be about the propositions. Because when it becomes about the propositions, that's when you're basically constructing idols.
Well, but John made that point too, because he said, what's the term? Like, whatever always has to serve religio, like the binding.
Right.
What's the other term?
Right. So the purpose of propositions is to build toward a vision of the real.
What was the other term that he talked about? It was religio and it was doctrine or
credo.
Credo always has to serve religio. And this is like,
Paul, I give my heart versus I assert a proposition.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And Paul, I said this to you in our first conversation, by the way. First time I ever talked to you, like over 2 years ago, I said this to you, and maybe you'll hear it now because John Vervaeke said it. But I said it to you. Take that, Paul.
Do you feel a little bit vindicated by this conversation in terms of like?
Because even, I mean, and it's whatever. That's just ego if it is. But even if people come to see all the stuff Vervaeke said, nobody's gonna be like, oh, Luke. I mean, I'm explicitly saying it here now, but like, whatever.
I said it before you said it. To be fair, it's like, hey, Luke was right.
Me even liking that is being caught up in like the egoic substance propositionalism. Like that would be wrong of me to even enjoy it. So any part of me that even enjoys it needs to die. So it's fine.
So how does credo properly serve religio? How do propositions properly function?
That is a fantastic question, Sam.
Yeah, because that's how propositions should function.
And that's the question that I was pushing on Paul too in my first conversation with him, because that's like,
and I
don't like your propositions, but you seem to like me. So what's up with that, right?
Yeah. Right. But this is the thing. It's like, because that's I think that's the role. It's like the basically love has to be the ground. It's like, if the propositions are taking you away from love, which doesn't mean love is not just blind affirmation, but if the propositions are taking you away from love and you're making like the whatever thing follows from the propositions, which is really just an object, if you're making that more central than the spirit of love, which is, as far as I'm concerned, like that's how we connect to the divine.
Yeah.
Like, then that's when you're going astray.
Which is non-dual and not binary. It's not an either or. It's not like you agree with me here or else you're out.
Right. It respects the unity and multiplicity. It keeps them in tension. It doesn't it's like, but it doesn't mean that like, but at the same time, it's not, like I said, it's not just blind affirmation. And the thing is that the thing that you ought to be using your propositional language for is trying to make that vision as clear as you can so that people can see it. I think poetic language is more effective, but you can use propositional language mostly in order to overcome error. So that
I don't know.
So that you can.
I want to add this in because I was talking about this in the box this morning. I was bringing up like not using your words though. This is the danger of proposition and why I keep saying like I almost see nothing more pernicious as a problem as the egoic intellect, because that's what using these propositions are, because that's the regurgitative knowledge to bring that back up. It's not your own. This is why when Jordan Peterson said in the trans argument, I'm not using your words. That's what he was getting at. He's saying, I'm not going to use your propositions. They're not mine. I'm not using yours, which is why this whole thing is so important. And I think he's right about that. It's why he was saying, I'm not going to affirm the literal resurrection because those are your words. They're not my words. I don't know that I believe them yet. So I'm not just going to say it. Which is
okay. So when you, okay, so let's say you think that like whatever's going on with like identitarianism is like harmful to people, right?
Yeah.
And you want to do that, like what tool are you going to use to demonstrate that?
See, this is where I'm going to lean back into the personalist thing. I don't think, and this is where I'll bring up that quote that I love so much, Michael, that you shared, that Frankl quote. You cannot know someone until you love them. So like this is where I would argue we're always, like Rob Bell says, God is the thing how does he say it? He's like, God is about the thing about which we cannot talk, and yet we will not stop talking, or something like that. Like you cannot speak of God, but yet we must not stop speaking about him. Like you're never going to nail it down, but you have to always be doing it. That's what proposition.
That's important. That's important too, right? Because this is the other key factor to keep from going astray with the propositions, is that you have to have the intellectual honesty to acknowledge that you're never going to get the picture when you're talking about these kinds of things. You're never going to have it nailed down. You're never going to have it absolutely right.
And that's what they were talking about with maps and globes. And I think that got a little bit misunderstood. I think Vervaeke wasn't saying the globe is the final answer. I think he was just saying it was much better.
It was better than a map.
Better than a map. And that theoretically there's something even better than a globe, right?
Which would be the thing itself.
Yeah. And like that was when he was talking about Bayesian updating, right? That's like a statistical machine learning thing of how to properly incorporate errors to continually fine tune.
But here's where Luke is right. Propositions are not how you get to the thing itself. propositions at best can only point toward the thing itself. It can error correct. It can error correct so that it doesn't lead you away from the thing itself, right? So it can do that. This is the proper role. In my view, that is the proper role of propositions, just to error correct so that you're not led away from the thing itself, but it cannot lead you to the thing itself. The only way to get to the thing itself is by participation with it, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and this is where I'll quote for all you Reformed Augustine loving folks, you know, a doctrine is a hedge around a mystery. That's a short version of everything we're saying.
Right.
And if you're never gonna get to the thing itself. Right. And that's why, like,
and this is why like, okay, you're Orthodox, I'm a fence-sitting Anglican, and Sam is a Unitarian. Our theology is all different, but you know what? We all know that we're looking for the same thing itself, whatever that is. And we all are aware of the fact that our propositions are going to fall short of being able to describe the thing itself. And that's what allows for us to have a conversation that is in the right spirit.
And I think the other good thing about propositions is that they're more easily transmissible than participation, right? I can't give you my participation nearly as easily as I can give you my propositions. So it helps other people catch up more quickly, right? You could say it's like a way to cheat off of someone's homework so that you can get to hopefully a higher level of participation faster than if you were to have to go through the whole updating error process yourself. Like I can go to someone who previously thought the earth was flat, presumably, and say, hey, it's a globe, right? And, communicate this to them, and that can get transmitted kind of quickly, right? Without them having to do all the science themselves. But it still must not be thought of as the end goal, right? And I think that is part of the purpose of propositions, and that's also part of the danger of propositions, right? Every aspect of something has a good side and a bad side, and one of the good aspects of propositions is that they're easily transmissible and that they can be transmitted at a faster and higher scale, right? You can broadcast propositions. Like I can get up in front of a classroom and share propositions. I can blast it out onto the internet and share propositions, and that for better or for worse. And that's part of what they do, is that they can go between people's ears faster than me trying to give you my internal participative or perspectival experience, which I can't really do.
Well, so
it's data compression. This is how the finite gets in, or the infinite gets into the finite.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes, but I don't know. So not to get super bogged down, but basically everything you just said, Sam, I don't agree with. I don't think so. You can transmit propositions maybe at scale, but you can't transmit belief at scale because it's personal.
I don't think Sam was saying that you can transmit belief at scale. I don't think that's what he was
saying.
Right.
I'm saying it's like a shortcut. It's like the cheating. That was the cheating on the homework analogy. I can get you I can transmit propositions to help you along the way in your own participative journey, but you still have to, in some sense,
let me give you a particular example of that. Like, let's say someone's like let's say someone is an atheist, and it's like they've never had like St. Thomas Aquinas's like third way argument for the existence of God, which is the argument from contingency and necessity. They've never had that explained to them properly.
Mm-hmm.
I can explain that to them properly, and it's like, oh, maybe this idea that God exists is more plausible than I thought it was. It doesn't give them access to the thing itself, but it opens a possibility space for a vision of the thing itself to become more possible than it was before.
It's like recipes and learning to cook, right? Like I can give you the recipe for cooking a really good steak. And like, if you've never cooked a steak before, a recipe is extremely helpful, but we've all had the experience where we try to follow a recipe and botch it because the recipe isn't the actual procedural knowledge of how to cook a really good steak.
Right.
It's a compression algorithm of that. But nevertheless, if you've never done it before, reading a recipe is incredibly helpful. So that's something like, recipes are compressed propositional explanations that are approximating the procedural knowledge of how to do something.
Yes. And all language is magic.
Yeah.
I mean, like literally, like it's like, I don't think we take that seriously as materialists, but like, we don't know the depths to what it goes, even in the most mundane, spells that we cast, like just saying hi to somebody. We don't, I think the depths there are pretty tremendous.
Right. Well, I would say, Michael, that I would say not only that it's magic, but it falls into two species of magic. Like, so language can be used for what I would, for shorthand, I'm going to call sorcery, where it is like it's designed to control, to manipulate, and for me to gain power.
To instrumentalize.
Yes, it's an instrumentalized use. Like so it can be used in that way, and it can also be used to enchant. So like, which is what I would say is going on when you read like a really beautiful poem, right? Like it's music. It's music to your soul. It's singing being into you. And that's a completely other magical use of language.
And I would say both are always going on again. And again, like you're trying to push towards the one in certain situations and going to the other. In Barfield's book, it's called Speaker's Meaning. He says there's two things we're trying to do. We're trying to have accuracy in what we say, and we're trying to have expression. And in some sense, those two poles kind of fight each other. Like the more you express yourself, the less accuracy you might have in what is communicated, but and going the other way, vice versa. So there's like this, the two are necessary for one another, because you can't have any expression if there isn't, like, you don't understand the language I'm using, and vice versa. So like there's this weird thing, there's this polarity going on with those things.
Right. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me. That makes me think of my forest and trees analogy that I'm always thinking of, because I'm a very, like, if I had to think of a style of painting of how my brain works, it's like Impressionism. Like, it's just the forest. There's a lack of precision. There's not very much like accuracy of all the trees. Like, that isn't there. Like, I have very little detail. I can't explain the trees to you. Like, if you're trying to see a forest through an explanation of the trees, I'm not your guy. I just see forest. Right. I can't give you trees.
Well, I would say, Michael, since you brought that up, and clearly you're drawing on Barfield here, I would say like the best shorthand way for people to understand what Barfield is driving about the idea of final participation is the conscious use of the enchanted mode of language. Like the conscious and intentional use of language in the enchanted
it's the
mode
icons versus idols.
Right. So,
all right. Well,
all right, guys, have a hard awkward stop. I'm tapped out.
I have a hard awkward stop too. So
yeah.
This was fun. I will stop the recording here.